Okay, in this video, we are going to continue reading Famine, Affluence, and Morality by Peter Singer. I will also share a link so that you can make your own copy of the text and mark it up, which I definitely recommend. Previously, we read the introduction, including the statement of the main claim. So the guiding question is, what should we think about situations like Bengal, where some of the key features of those situations are that people are at risk of suffering and dying from lack of the most basic resources, while other people have resources that they use on things that possibly by their own lights are not morally significant, and certainly not as morally significant as the life of children who are amongst the human beings at risk of suffering and dying from lack of the most basic resources. And so his answer to this question, which he will argue for in the paper, is that the way people in relatively affluent countries react to situations like this, these humanitarian crises, can't be justified. And how is it that people act? By not doing anything or enough while going on with their lives, using their resources for things that perhaps by their own lights don't really matter. Indeed, he says, the whole way we look at moral issues, our moral conceptual scheme needs to be altered. So he's challenging a status quo way of thinking about it, possibly the way most people think about things, or at least what most people do, whether they think about it at all. But most people don't think they do anything wrong. They think that sending money would be a great act of charity, a very nice thing to do, but it's not wrong not to. And that's what Singer is challenging. He's arguing that it is wrong not to. The doing nothing can't be justified. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. We morally ought to be doing something if we can, certain conditions. We looked at the principle, we'll return to it in a moment. And so he's challenging the whole way we look at moral issues. Who's we? Something like most people or many people, or a sort of status quo way of looking at moral issues. Okay, so we get the first two premises of the argument, the main value and principle premises, and then we map to the argument. So the principle is, if it's in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, and doing so doesn't require that you sacrifice anything morally significant, then you ought to do that thing. Suffering and death are very bad. It's in our power to prevent those things, specifically from the lack of the most basic resources. It's in our power to prevent those things, and we can do it. Again, who's we? This will only apply to the we who does have the resources, whether that's money or mental energy, whatever resources it takes to act. The people who have those resources and can use them to effectively prevent suffering and death from lack of the most basic resources for other people have an obligation to do it if the three criteria are met. And he thinks it generally is met. And this is what he means by sacrificing something of moral significance. It would be a sacrifice if any of these things happened. From here on out, we're not going to focus on these two premises in the argument. So I'm going to just like make them gray to indicate that we're not really going to critically evaluate these premises about what we can do and about at what cost. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that it is in our power to prevent suffering and death from lack of the most basic resources, and assume that we, whoever the we is, there are many we, who can do something without sacrificing anything of real moral significance. And then, like Singer, we'll also assume that suffering and death from lack of basic resources is a bad thing. What should we think of this principle? Because one can coherently say, even if it is in my power and I have the resources, I'm not morally obligated to use them in this particular way. It is morally permissible of me to use them on whatever I want, including a 20th pair of shoes. It's in the rest of the paper that we get an argument for the principle itself. Something to highlight before we get into the argument for the principle is this first sentence after introducing the principle. He says, the uncontroversial appearance of the principle just stated is deceptive. What does he mean when he says that? Why does he say that? I mean, when he first introduced the principle above, he said, this principle seems almost as uncontroversial as the last one, the idea that suffering and dying from starvation is a bad thing. It requires us only to prevent what's bad, promote what's good, and requires this only when we can do it without having to sacrifice something that is, at least from the moral point of view, comparably important. Or if we lower the bar, as we said, let's go with this qualified principle, then it doesn't even have to be comparably important. If it would require the sacrifice of anything morally significant, then it's not required that you do so. But if you can, and it doesn't require the sacrifice of something morally significant, you morally ought to. He says, this seems completely uncontroversial, especially if we go with the lower bar. But it's deceptive. It's deceptively uncontroversial. Most people will hear it and be like, yeah, sounds good. Prevent bad things, promote good things. Yeah, that's what we should do. But most people don't live in accordance with this principle, and they don't think there's anything wrong with that. As he continues, if this were acted upon, even in the qualified form, that's this form, our lives, society, and world would be fundamentally changed. Why? Because this principle doesn't account for proximity or distance. It doesn't just say help toddlers when you come across them in ponds. It says anytime you could use your resources that aren't going to be used for something that is significant, anytime you could use those resources to prevent suffering and death from the lack of the most basic resources for other people, you morally ought to. It doesn't say do it once. It says anytime this is relevant. And secondly, it doesn't make a distinction between your being the only person who could help versus being one of millions of people who could help. In the pond case, you're the only one who could help, but you're not the only one who could help in the case of humanitarian aid crises. But if you can prevent suffering and death, not solve the whole thing on your own, but prevent some amount of suffering and death in some way, this principle says you're morally required to do it, and that not doing it, doing nothing, is wrong. That is much stronger than people initially realize when they first read the principle. It demands more than you might think. That's what he means when he says the uncontroversial appearance is deceptive. And he knows it is. He's telling us right up front, this is not an uncontroversial moral principle. This principle actually demands quite a lot of us, more than we usually think we're required to do. And so it is the task of the paper then to argue that we should accept that principle. We're going to read the next couple of paragraphs, something like 8 through 13, but I'm going to skip one. And then I will give you a short outline of the rest of the paper, and I will leave it up to you which parts to read, depending on what you might end up writing about later. Before we really dig into the paper, I just want to highlight the argumentative strategy. Instead of giving, because you might be wondering, right, how do you argue for a moral principle? He gives the pond case, this scenario, and sometimes this is treated as like it's just illustrating how the principle works. But we might take this as some kind of support for the principle, as in, instead, let's say the principle explains why we have an obligation to rescue the child in the pond scenario, because it's plausible to think that we do. And this provides a plausible explanation for why. When I give a survey to my students before reading this paper, as I sometimes do, I ask them, one, do you think one morally ought to rescue the child? Not just would you do it, but that's just a descriptive claim about what you would do, but should you? Are you required to? Would it be wrong not to? And higher than 90% of students say yes. And then I asked to like, just give me your initial, like, why is that? Why would it be wrong not to? And almost without exception, people say something about the cost, the comparison. We've got the life of a child on one side and possibly ruining fancy shoes and being late for something on the other. They are inclined, as a matter of just intuitive response, to focus on weighing what's important and doing the thing that is more important. So it fits really well with things that seem intuitively plausible. The goal here is not to describe how we happen to make our moral judgments and why, but that we have a principled reason to support those intuitive judgments, that it's consistent with it, might provide some amount of support, not knock down unambiguous, unobjectionable support, but some amount of support for the principle. A question you might ask, I'm going to highlight where there are open questions for you to think about. A question you might ask is there a better explanation for why we have an obligation to rescue the child? Because if you accept Singer's principle, it seems to follow by way of analogy that we also have obligations to help in a wide range of humanitarian crises, not just when we happen to encounter a child in a pond, which hopefully will never happen to anyone. But analogously, we have the same capacity to do the same kind of good with roughly the same resources, just in a different way. Clearly it's indirect, and that raises questions about knowing what's in our power and how sure we can be, but we're never sure about the consequences of our actions 100%. So it does seem to be analogous. Is there any possible explanation for why we have an obligation in the pond case, and yet we don't in humanitarian crises generally across the world? One might say something like this. This principle doesn't account for distance, but it should. That might be one way to identify why we do have an obligation in this case, but we don't when it comes to people around the world. Distance is somehow relevant. And I added the word morally here. Maybe we should just say distance is relevant. Why is distance relevant? Might be the next question. What do you think? Are you inclined to think distance is relevant? And if so, why is it relevant? What students usually immediately say is, I'm just better able to effectively help, to be effective at helping people close by, people in my neighborhood or city or state or country, as the case may be. Or maybe as the chain gets more and more indirect, there's less ability to be sure or reasonably sure about what your actions' consequences will be. So something like that. And notice if we give reasons like this, these are purely practical reasons. I don't have to say something like, look, people who are nearby are more important. People in my neighborhood are more important. People in my state are more important. People in my in-group are more important. I could say everyone is equally valuable. I'm just better equipped to help people in my sort of physical proximity because I can see what's needed. I can act. I'm able to assess whether or not my actions are effective. Those things are harder to do when people are far away. Those are practical considerations. What if we were able to argue that one of the most effective things you could do in order to relieve suffering and death, to prevent suffering and death from the most basic lack of the most basic resources, one of the most effective things you can do is send money to an aid organization. We live in a highly connected world where it is so easy to share money and resources. You can immediately have a face-to-face conversation with someone on the other side of the planet. It's not hard to move money and resources around. And there are aid organizations who are streamlined to make a real impact where resources are needed. There are other organizations that monitor aid organizations for their levels of transparency and effectiveness. There are many reasons to think that one can be very effective in sending money to aid organizations. So assume for the sake of argument, as we said before, we can be effective. Let's assume for the sake of argument that we can be effective. Is there any other non-practical reason to think distance matters, such that a moral principle ought to take account of it? Yes, when the person is in front of you, you are morally required to act, but when the person is on the other side of the planet, you're not. Is there any reason to think distance matters? And let's call it any just straight up practical reason. Say we can solve all the practical problems. Let's say, i.e., that is to say, that distance is morally relevant. That you have obligations to people near you that you just don't have to other people. It has nothing to do with how effective you are. Okay, so that's another question where there might be some opening for you to weigh in and think about it. Okay, so that's one way that we could try to draw a distinction between the child in the pond and the child who's far away. Distance matters. This principle doesn't take account of distance. It treats them exactly the same. Another that we've hinted at so far is this principle doesn't account for what people are doing, for what other people. And co-premise, it should. What others are doing matters. So here's the kind of reason people usually give for this. It's unfair. What's unfair? The moral principle, nobody's enforcing the moral principle. Singer isn't arguing this is a law that ought to be, I mean, maybe he would, but he's not. And he doesn't say that people should be forced or whatever. This is a question of what should we do from the perspective of moral reasoning, not what should we force people to do. But this moral principle would be unfair in some way, is a kind of objection that might come up. There's a lot of people in a position to help. If anything, my contribution, like if everybody were to chip in, my contribution might be more like $32 instead of as much as I can. But people aren't chipping in. How should we think about that? Well, I think Singer's principle doesn't say do your fair share. It says do what you can do. Should we put some kind of constraint on the principle that it can't require more than doing your fair share? So these are ways people might object to the principle in order to qualify it further. These are two objections that Singer specifically considers. Indeed, his whole approach to defending the principle is to defend it against objections. This is a really common argumentative strategy. You can provide what is sometimes called a positive argument for your claims. Think of that as whenever you put something under a green bar, you're giving reasons for your claims. You can also provide what is sometimes called a negative argument for a claim. You can consider objections and then argue against those. So instead of providing reasons, I'm deflecting well, deflecting almost sounds like you're not dealing with. I'm considering and undermining all the possible objections, such that if you can't come up with a plausible objection to the principle, then it stands. And so I'm going to, the author might say, for whatever paper, this paper or any other, I'm going to consider the very best objections to my principle. And if I can show one by one that none of them is convincing, my principle stands. That's his argumentative strategy. We're going to start with the idea that maybe it's not qualified enough. Maybe it isn't capturing something that's morally relevant, be it distance or what others are doing. Those are the only two things he considers. So there might be an additional question. Are there other differences, morally relevant, not just practical, but morally relevant differences between the child in the pond and the child on the other side of the planet? That this principle fails to account for. That it should account for. That's another follow-up question. When we start reading, we're going to be looking for Singer's objections to these two principles, or these two objections to objections. And because he's objecting to a hypothetical objection, I'm going to make these a different color, just to make it super clear that these are not claims Singer stands by. These are objections that one could make, plausible ones perhaps, that he is considering for the sake of argument. And notice I'm making this red too, because objections are arguments. Somebody who makes this objection and then gives a reason for it, it's still all part of an objection. This is just a reason to accept this claim in the objection. Objections are arguments too. And then here's another reason for that reason. So I'm going to make it pink, just so it's clear that that's a chunk that goes together. That's not things Singer is saying. Those are things one could say, and by rejecting those, we can further support our principle. And now I'm going to leave this one white because this one is him actually, or this is, I guess, us, but we'll see he says something like this, objecting to that. Okay, and likewise, so I'm going to make this pink. What I'm doing to change the boxes is I'm right-clicking and going to node style. You can also go to it up here. And then in the background, you can choose from a palette of really ugly colors, or you can go to enter color and just type in letters of the alphabet, and sometimes better ones pop up. Okay, so as we'll see in a moment, he considers these objections and responds to them. We'll take a look at that. Then after that, he considers a more general kind of objection that goes something like this. This principle is too demanding, or similar, but technically slightly different, but I'm going to group them together. This principle is too sort of it's just implausible because it doesn't fit with how we usually think about things. It's really demanding, more demanding than we usually think morality is, and those two claims are technically different, but they go together. And so this is one of the main objections that he's going to consider in the paper. And this is really one of the main objections we're going to be thinking about. Singer's principle is demanding. He says it right up front, paragraph 7. The uncontroversial appearance of this principle is deceptive. It's way more demanding than we usually think morality is. We don't usually think it's morally required to act to help others in this way. It's a nice thing to do, but not morally required. That's how we usually think about it. And he says that way of looking at things doesn't stand up to reason. We should accept this principle, and there are no good objections to it, including its demandingness and how we think about deviating from how we think about our obligations. So this is the main type of objection I want us to focus on for the next week or so. And some questions, just to outline initially some questions we're going to ask is, how should we think about consensus in this case? We've been talking about consensus throughout the class. When is consensus, if ever, a legitimate piece of evidence? And we've looked at cases where it seems like it is. When is consensus a legitimate piece of evidence? Is consensus about what's morally required and what's not a legitimate piece of evidence, and thus some reason, not a knockdown argument against, but some reason to think there must be something wrong with Singer's principle? We appealed to it earlier in talking about the pawn scenario providing some amount of support for the principle. You might think that the fact that it explains, it gives a really plausible account of why we have an obligation we all agree we have, counts as some amount of support for the theory. We're not asking a moral theory to just describe how we happen to behave, but if there are some touch points that we feel pretty secure about, like we're morally required to rescue a small child in front of us. A lot of things are fuzzy, but that one's not. If we have a plausible account of why that is, that seems to count for the theory. But if we generally think we don't have obligations to act in certain other ways, how should we think about our intuitions here and the fact that this principle conflicts with them? Is consensus about what's morally required a legitimate piece of evidence? How does Kelly's account apply here? We're also going to look at a number of, or at least a couple of ways of disagreeing with the principle that will cut down on its demandingness, that will bring it back into line with what people often think. We'll look at a qualified version that kind of picks up on this it's unfair line of argument, and we'll consider the position that we shouldn't accept this principle because we shouldn't accept we have any duties to help anyone ever. It's great if we do. Helping's great. I think you should do it. I love helping. I don't think I'm morally required to. So that's a kind of position you might take. And we'll take a look at that position and how that compares and contrasts with Singer's. So we're going to be looking at arguments against this principle that focus on the demandingness and the fact that it deviates from how we usually think about our moral obligations. That's our big picture question. And Singer's argument for the moral principle is to defend it against objections, that we shouldn't qualify it. These things aren't morally relevant and so don't need to be taken into consideration. And that the fact that it deviates from how we usually think about stuff is not itself an objection. He goes some way in arguing against this. That's the strategy of the whole paper. Okay, let's dig in. Paragraph 8. I don't think I need to say much in defense of the refusal to take proximity and distance into account. The fact that a person is physically near us so that we have a personal contact with him may make it more likely that we shall assist him, but this doesn't show that we ought to. It doesn't show that we ought to help him rather than another who happens to be further away. Right? So we're not talking about what we do. We're talking about what we should do. We probably are more likely to help people close to us, but what we happen to do does not automatically imply anything about what we ought to do. There's a separate step we have to make. Why I think we ought to help the person closer rather than further away. Yes, it's just natural, but like, why should we? He continues. And notice he's responding to an objection here. So I've italicized it just to highlight. He's taking objections seriously and responding to them. This is an example of what that looks like. If we accept any principle of impartiality, universalizability, equality, or whatever, then we can't discriminate against someone merely because they are far away. I mean, we technically can, but reasonably, we can't reasonably. Right? Well, what's all this big language here? Like, look, distance doesn't matter. If we accept any kind of principle of impartiality, universalizability, or whatever, then distance doesn't matter. Those are just a lot of big words. He's referring here to lots of claims and assumptions generally made in a background conversation about our moral obligations and the standards we ought to hold our actions to. Here's an example of a similar type of claim in an intro level textbook that is widely assigned in intro ethics courses. In chapter 1, the author considers this question: what exactly is morality? And he argues that there are many different conceptions of morality, not just what you happen to think is moral or some kind of human psychology, but what should our moral outlook be, and what, for example, you might think a principle like Singer's gives us some kind of moral guidance to how we should engage with the world. So he thinks any kind of moral perspective or approach or framework needs to have just two basic things. There's a minimum conception of morality, he says. It should involve reason, not just acting on gut responses, but then holding them up to reason and deciding what we should do and why, and try to do it in the most principled way possible. What are the relevant principles and how do they apply here? Those are often difficult questions. Principles don't apply themselves. And also that we should be impartial. The minimum conception, the minimum requirement for engaging with questions from some kind of principled moral framework is that you're engaging with giving reasons and that you're being impartial. I'm going to select a little quote from the end here. So to get to this point, he looks at a bunch of cases and applies some principles and comes to some conclusions about some tough cases. And what we learn from it is the importance of reasoning our way through these cases, he says, as well as the requirement that we be impartial. And so I want to skip to the takeaway point. The requirement of impartiality, then, is at bottom nothing more than a prescription against arbitrariness in dealing with people. It's a rule that forbids us from treating one person differently from another when there's no good reason to do so. This explains what's wrong with racism, and it also explains with some other kinds of cases that we don't need to get into to make our point here. But this idea that how we deal with people shouldn't be arbitrary. And if we're going to treat two cases or two people differently, there should be some principled reason, some good reason for treating them differently. So in our map, I said, is there, where did I put my question? I said, are there any relevant differences between the child in the pond and the child that's far away? If you're going to treat them differently, there should be some good reason for treating them differently. And so that's all we mean right here when we say, if we accept any principle of impartiality, universalizability, or equality, that we should treat people equally unless we have a good reason not to. What could count as a good reason? Is the fact that a person is far away a good reason? Let's continue on. Admittedly, it is possible we're in a better position to judge what needs to be done to help a person near us than one far away, and then also perhaps provide the assistance we judge to be necessary. So that could be a reason to prioritize people close than people far away. He responds, indeed, if this were the case, it would be a reason for helping those near to us first. This may once have been a justification for being more concerned with the poor in one's town than with famine victims in India. But unfortunately, for those who like to keep their moral responsibilities limited, instant communication and swift transportation have changed the situation. From the moral point of view, the development of the world into a kind of global village has made an important, though still unrecognized, difference to our moral situation. Expert observers and supervisors sent out by famine relief organizations or permanently stationed in famine-prone areas can direct our aid to a refugee in Bengal almost as effectively as we could get it to someone on our own block. There would seem, therefore, to be no possible justification for discriminating on geographical grounds. Right, so how does that go here? He says, one could object something like this. And he says, this line of argument would be good except for the fact that we do have technology and ability to communicate and interact in ways that make this probably not true. And so let's assume, again, the practical stuff is there. We can help and we can do so effectively. Okay, he also considers this point, right? So someone might say, it should. It's only natural. People are like inclined. Right, so that's part of the objection. And what does he say to that? Basically, who cares? That's irrelevant. I'm not asking why do people do what they do, like explain the behavior, tell me what's natural. I'm asking what people should do. So he doesn't deny this. We don't want to put an objection here. He doesn't say it's not natural and people are inclined to help people who are far away just as much as close by. He says, so what? The question isn't what's normal or natural, it's what should we do? Another way, like distance may be psychologically relevant, but it's not morally relevant. We're not trying to describe how we behave. We're asking what should we do? And there's no good reason, he says, to treat the person far away differently. The only good reason would be, are you better equipped to help the person close to you? But he thinks that's probably not even true, especially if the people close to you aren't going to die of diarrhea or some other very basic condition associated with lack of basic resources. So That's where we stand with distance. Where is there room to ask further questions? Are there any other ways to think about distance? Are there any other morally relevant features that might be related to distance? Do we have different obligations to members of our own community because they're members of our community? That wouldn't be a case where distance is itself the morally relevant factor, but that the relationship you have to your community is the morally relevant factor, and your community happens to be nearby, usually. Is something like that relevant as a response here? That's a kind of question you might ask here, right? So how should we think about our relationships to the people who just happen to be physically closer to us? Let's read on. There may be greater need to defend the second implication of my principle, that the fact that there are millions of other people in the same position does not make the situation different from the one in which I'm the only person who can prevent something bad from happening, like in the pond case. Again, of course, I admit there is a psychological difference between the cases. One feels less guilty about doing nothing if one can point to others similarly placed who've also done nothing. Yet, this can make no real difference to our moral obligations. Should I consider that I'm less obliged to pull the drowning child out of the pond if, on looking around, I see other people no further away than I am who've also noticed the child but are doing nothing? One has only to ask the question to see the absurdity of the view that numbers lessen obligation. It is a view that is an ideal excuse for inactivity. Unfortunately, most of the major evils, poverty, overpopulation, pollution, are problems in which everyone is almost equally involved. So we don't have that line in the argument yet. It's like this. It's only natural. It's what people are inclined to do, right? So we might say, something like this. And we should keep track of our page or our paragraph numbers, right? So this was paragraph 8. Now we're talking about, and this was also in paragraph 8. All of this is paragraph 8. Maybe I'll just put the whole, you can add a little line label as well to a section. To do that, I clicked on the box and then I clicked the label option. I'll just do that. And now we're looking at paragraph 9. It's good to keep track of where you found stuff, so that way it's really easy to cite your sources later should you end up writing about something. It's also important to keep track of which things are coming from the text and which things are your own ideas. And that's one thing that's nice about the sticky notes. You can add sticky notes and you can change the colors of stuff when you want to add, here are my thoughts. These are not just me summarizing the author. And identifying questions is a super good thing to do. Okay, so it's only natural. When others aren't helping, we don't feel bad for not helping. What is his response to this objection? Does he say, it's not natural? No, he agrees. Yeah, that's right. I admit, he says, like when you consider something that one might offer as an objection, and you think like, yeah, I see that that's true, but I don't think it undermines my point. Then this is how we visualize that. I see that that's true. The question is, so what? Another way you might think of the so what answer is thinking like, even if that's true, maybe it is, maybe it's not. Even if that's true, it doesn't undermine my point, or that doesn't support thinking that what others are doing is morally relevant. I'm just going to use the shorter one though. So what? What others are doing is, let's put it in the same words. It may be psychologically relevant, but it's not morally relevant. Support for this, and he refers to the sort of variation on the pond case. imagine there's lots of people standing around who could all help, and they don't have any excuse not to. It's not like they're physically unable or paralyzed by fear in some way. They're just not helping. Would that change whether or not you ought to help? It might change whether or not you or one does help. We're often highly affected by people around us. But does it change whether or not you ought to, is the question. And he thinks this case is clear, and he uses language that suggests it couldn't be any clearer, right? One only has to ask the question to see the absurdity of the view. But we can always ask the question and consider whether or not it is absurd or not. Do you find this compelling? You could add that as a sticky note if you are interested. Is it just obvious there? But okay, so that's his response to that line of objection. Let's keep reading. Paragraph 10. The view that numbers do make a difference can be made plausible if stated in this way. And notice how he's setting up, I've highlighted in red, the hypothetical objections, where he's working to come up with what's a plausible thing someone could say or a common thing someone could say that I think just doesn't undermine my view. Okay, so the view that numbers do make a difference could be made plausible if stated this way. He's not saying he agrees with it and he thinks it's plausible. He's giving a charitable reconstruction of an objection so he can undermine it, because that will provide more support for his premise. If we don't consider the best objections and consider them in their strongest form, then we haven't really defended our claims against objections. If everyone in circumstances like mine gave £5, $5 or whatever to a relief fund, then there'd be enough to provide food, shelter, and medical care for the refugees. There's no reason why I should give more than anyone else in the same circumstances. Therefore, I have no obligation to give more than $5 or pounds or whatever. So how should we think about that? I wrote it very simply. It's unfair, but obviously this could be spelled out in more detail, and would be if you wanted to very carefully map the argument. But I'm just trying to capture the structure of the argument in broad, and look how complicated it is already. And I've been doing it in very broad, sort of somewhat simple terms. Like, I'm not unpacking every sentence and how it fits together. I'm just trying to get the basic structure down. Okay. What does he say about it? He says, each premise in this argument is true. It's true that if everyone in my circumstances chipped in, there'd be enough to deal with this case. And maybe it's even true that there's no reason why I should give more than anyone else. True. Those are the two premises. Each premise in this argument is true, and the argument looks sound, but it's not. Sound means valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, and the premises are true. In this case, the premises are true, but he's going to argue it's not valid. Even if the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't follow. It may convince us unless we notice that it's based on a hypothetical premise, but the conclusion is not stated hypothetically, right? If everyone in circumstances like mine gave $5, there'd be enough. But everyone is in circumstances like mine is not giving $5, so it's unclear what follows. The argument would be sound if the conclusion were, if everyone in circumstances like mine were to give £5, then I would have no obligation to give more than £5. If the conclusion were so stated, however, it would be obvious that the argument has no bearing on the actual situation in which it's not the case that everyone else gives £5, which is our actual situation. So it's more or less certain that not everyone in circumstances like mine is going to give £5, so there just isn't going to be enough money to provide the food, shelter, and medical care. Therefore, by giving more, I will prevent more suffering than if I just gave 5. I can do more. The principle says, if you can prevent suffering and death, if I give my £5 and in fact other people aren't chipping in, then giving another 5 would go further, and giving another 5 still would go further. Each one of those would be an opportunity to prevent suffering and death. And you're, according to the principle, required to do so up to the point where you'd have to sacrifice something morally significant is the low bar. For the high bar, you'd have to sacrifice something comparable to the life of a child. But morally significant is much lower, but still higher than what many people think is required. Okay, I'm going to skip this part here because I think this is the least interesting and part of the objection, but gets into the weeds a bit. Feel free to read it and think about it if you're so inclined. Okay, so that wraps up here. He puts it differently. He actually never uses, well, he does say it would be unfair to require more. And in some sense it is, like, it's unfair that other people aren't doing more and you are doing your share, but because the situation we're in is one that includes what other people are doing or not doing. It's why there's so much to do that so many people aren't doing anything. Like, that's part of the description. And life's not fair because not everyone chips in. So he doesn't deny that it's unfair or that if everyone did it, you'd only have to give $5. Again, it says, the fact is, giving more than what would be one's fair share, let's say one. Not everyone's chipping in. So something like this. Look how much I simplified the reasoning here. And unless I'm going to really, if I was going to write a paper about that argument, then I'd start mapping that out perfectly. But if I'm not sure what to focus on, I'm just trying to capture the main points of the moves in the argument. And I'll come back later and unpack an argument more if I'm going to write about it. Okay, so then he kind of wraps up here. So if my argument so far has been sound, it is valid. It's 100% valid. If the premises, these ones, if these premises are true, the conclusion must be true. There is no possible objection you could put here that says, even if these premises are true, it doesn't follow I ought to donate. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And if all the premises are actually true, then it's sound. And he's been really focusing on this. So far, we haven't been given a good objection to the principle. Each one I've considered, I've defended, or I've objected to. And so my principle seems to stand. So if my argument is sound, then neither our distance from a preventable evil, a bad thing happening, nor the number of people who, in respect to that evil, are in the same situation as we are, lessens our obligation to mitigate or prevent that evil. I shall therefore take as established the principle I asserted earlier. And again, we only need to assert it in the qualified form, the lower bar. Okay, so at this point, I'm just going to skim the basic structure of the rest of the paper, and you can read the parts that are most interesting to you, depending on what you end up writing about later. For now, it's enough that you just know these parts are here to come back to. Okay, so I'm going to read little snippets, but again, this is supposed to be a preview. In this section, he talks about the implications of the argument so far for thinking about this difference between duty and charity that we often sort of make. He says the outcome of the argument is that our traditional moral categories, our traditional way of thinking is upset, is undermined, is criticized. Specifically, the traditional distinction between duty, what you're morally required to do, and charity, what's morally optional to do, can't be drawn. Because now helping, giving your money to the things we literally call charities, is a moral obligation on this argument. So this is another way to say that the uncontroversialness of the moral principle could be deceptive at first. It makes things people typically think of as charity a duty. We can't draw that distinction anymore. Okay, so he talks about the distinction between duty and charity. And the implications of this lead to even further objections. So one is, it's just too unorthodox. It's too drastic a revision of what most people think our usual moral scheme. People don't ordinarily judge the way I've suggested they should. if the principle is true. Most people reserve moral condemnation for those who violate some moral norm, such as like theft. They don't condemn people who indulge in luxury instead of giving to famine relief. But he's not trying to give a description of the way people make moral judgments. He's trying to give an argument. How should we think about the fact that his principle does deviate pretty significantly from our usual moral scheme or moral norms, how we usually think about what is acceptable and what's not? So there's a whole section on that. Then he turns to the objection that it's too demanding. And he considers another range of practical objections. For example, maybe it's the best place to, or the best way to handle or think about responsibility in this kind of case is at the level of government and not individuals. Recall in the intro paragraph, he talks about what individuals and what governments are doing. And maybe it is, and he says, but given the government or whatever larger organization that individuals could be part of, if there isn't a larger organization that's dealing with the problem, then individuals have to think about what is their obligation in a world where the ideal way of handling things isn't panning out. And furthermore, perhaps if individuals actually gave or made this an issue, maybe that is how you get government action, something like that. He also talks about long-term consequences. For example, he says maybe a roundabout way of thinking about this, but maybe if we help, we end up in the long run doing more harm than good in some complex indirect way. So for example, if there's some kind of population problem and the underlying causes of famine and whatever issues aren't dealt with, then merely sending food aid now just postpones starvation and perhaps at a even worse level later. This kind of argument might have been made in the context of thinking about North Korea. This is the kind of argument that the author, the researcher for Doctors Without Borders, was making in the article we read. The cause of famine is serious mismanagement and a terrible government. And if we send food aid, all we do is prop up that government. That food aid doesn't reach the citizens, the rural citizens who need it the most. Instead, it goes to the government to be distributed to people who need it the least, so that the government continues to stay in place and enact policies that harm its people. So if you think that's what acting does, then he says something like that, then yeah, maybe we don't have an obligation here. But if there's any other way that we could act so as to deal with the problem rather than just dealing with the present, suffering and death from starvation alone, then do that. My moral principle, he says, doesn't say send money throw money at problem. It says act to prevent suffering and death. And if the most effective way to do that is to work on causes and not get food to the people who are currently starving, then do that. That's essentially what he says here. Or what if there are negative consequences of increasing aid at like the government level? He considers that and responds to it. Finally, there's a postscript added after the original publication, and something he deals with in the postscript is what counts as moral significant, like what morally significant means, since that's part of the principle. So long as you are not forced to sacrifice something morally significant. And he answers this question here, or doesn't answer it and says it doesn't need to be answered. It's unclear. Maybe there is a good account of what counts as morally significant. But even if we leave it up to the individual, this principle, if people are being honest with themselves, this principle is going to require people to do more than they usually do. But there might be lots of wiggle room for talking about moral significance. saving for retirement and sending your kids to sports camps or all kinds of things are arguably morally significant. And so his claim here is, think about the use of resources and can you genuinely say these things are morally significant? What does that mean to you? If you're being honest with yourself, do you have resources that are not going to something morally significant? If so, then if you can turn them into prevention of suffering and death, you ought to. And again, immediate food aid versus other forms of assistance, it's just obvious that we can feed hungry people. And sometimes that is the most effective thing we can do to prevent suffering. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't deal with underlying causes and that it's not really important to think about long-term investments. Okay, so those are some of the things you'll find in the paper if you read it later, depending on what you focus on in your next paper of your own, paper 1B, which is primarily going to be thinking about the demandingness of this principle. What's the best objection we could spell out, and what ultimately should we think?